When you were in school, did some teachers ever give you a pop quiz? Remember those things? I hated them. You come to class thinking you were going to hear a lecture, and they tell you to take out a piece of paper and a pencil and answer these following questions. Well, I'm going to give you a pop quiz. If I were to ask you, what book of the Bible would you go to if you wanted to know about the subject of wisdom? What would you say?
Proverbs.
Hey, not bad. Good. Since we're doing a series of wisdom in Proverbs, I would expect you to say that. But suppose I said, what book would you go to if you wanted to discuss the subject of righteousness?
I know.
She doesn't count. It's my wife. I think I would be tempted to say the book of Exodus because it has the Ten Commandments in it, or the book of Romans. The whole subject, in my opinion, of Romans is righteousness, or Galatians. And there's even a verse about righteousness in the book of Genesis. But you might be surprised to know that the book of Proverbs has a great deal to say about righteousness. So, in this series in Proverbs, today we're going to discuss righteousness in the book of Proverbs. So, turn in your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 14. Proverbs chapter 14. Now, before we look at that verse, which I'll tell you about in a minute, I want to put this subject in the context biblically. I said a minute ago, the book of Romans talks about righteousness. Let me tell you what it says. In Romans chapter 4, verse 5, it says, "But to him that does not work, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted for righteousness." So there is in the Bible something called justification by faith. The word justification means righteous. You are declared righteous by faith. This is a concept that is taught throughout the Bible, starting with Genesis. Genesis 15:6 says, Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. But most people don't really understand it. So let me give you my favorite illustration of justification. Declared righteous. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, "He who knew no sin became sin for us that we might be made the righteousness of God in him." Now what that verse is saying is this. He who knew no sin. I'm going to let this represent sin. Put it in my left hand. He who knew no sin became sin for us that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. And I'm going to let this white handkerchief represent the righteousness of Christ. Got it? Now let's do it like this. He who knew no sin became sin for us. Christ died for our sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him.
Amen.
The Bible teaches he gets our sin by dying for our sin on the cross and being raised from the dead, and we get his righteousness when we trust him for the gift of eternal life.
Amen.
So if you trust Christ, God then views you as wrapped up in the righteousness of Christ. You are declared righteous. Now let me read you the verse again in Romans 4:5. "But to him who does not work," let that sink in. You don't do anything. You don't have to be religious. You don't have to be righteous. To him that worketh not, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted for righteousness, right?
Amen.
So there is justification by faith. Now let me read you a verse in chapter 6 of Romans. Do you not know to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey? You are that one slaves whom you obey, whether to sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness. What? In chapter 4, he says it's by faith. In chapter 6, he says it's by obedience. How in the world do you untangle that? And the conclusion is there are two types of righteousness. There is justification by faith, where God declares you righteous. But that doesn't necessarily mean you do everything right. Right?
Yes.
As we all unfortunately know. So there is a practical righteousness, whereby we then start obeying the Lord, and that produces a practical righteousness in our life. To sort all of this out, theologians sometimes call this positional righteousness and practical righteousness. Positional righteousness is that in Christ we are clothed in the righteousness of Christ. Practical righteousness is what we do every day. Now, that, according to the New Testament, leads to being rewarded at the judgment seat of Christ. Now, how are we doing? We got this so far? This is the biblical subject of righteousness. We are declared righteous, and then we must practice righteousness. Now, I just said that the book of Proverbs talks about righteousness. Which kind of righteousness does it talk about? Practical righteousness. For example, Proverbs 14 verse 2 says, "He who walks in uprightness," which is a word for righteousness in the book of Proverbs, "fears the Lord." He who walks in uprightness. So all of the verses pertaining to righteousness in the book of Proverbs are talking about this day-to-day practical kind of righteousness. So what does that look like? What does practical righteousness look like? That is what I want us to talk about. But before I get into that, let me mention one more thing. There are a number of different Hebrew words that are translated righteousness in the book of Hebrews. As a matter of fact, there are 3. One means right, or a second means just or lawful. A third means justice. There are 4 words that are translated upright. One means just, another means straightness, a third means integrity, and a fourth means completeness. Notice there are 2 basic words that are translated a number of different ways, but both of them mean lawful. So both righteous and uprighteous are just. They are lawful. In other words, righteous people do what is right according to the law, Mosaic law. Simply put, this is really profound. In the book of Proverbs, righteousness is doing what is right. Told you that was going to be profound. Now, what I want to do is spell that out. And in looking at the wise and the fool and some of the other people in the book of Proverbs, as I have laid all the verses out, it seems to me that some of them have to do with what these kind of people think. It's what they are. I'm using the word think and are overlapping. Then a lot of the verses have to do with what they say. And then some of the verses have to do with what they do. Beautiful 3-point outline. We're going to talk about what righteous people think, what they really are inside. We're going to talk about what they say, and we're going to talk about what they do. You ready? Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of material here, and we're not going to walk through it, we're going to run through it. But I don't expect you to remember all these details. I want you to get the impression. What I want you to remember are these 3 basic things: what they are, what they say, and what they do. Okay, with all of that in mind, let's start with what righteous people think. The first passage I would think about is Proverbs 12:12. It says, "The wicked covet the catch of evil men, but the root of righteousness yields fruit." Now, if you'll recall, I've said that when a proverb has these two phrases like this and they're opposed to one another, the second one helps you understand the first and vice versa. So basically what this proverb is saying is that wicked people desire, they covet wicked stuff, evil stuff. It uses the word covet. So the second phrase indicates that the righteous people are coveting righteousness. So, very simply, a righteous person internally covets righteousness. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said, "He that hungers and thirsts after righteousness." There's a desire. I want to do what is right because it's right. The second thing I would say about the way they think is that they listen and they learn. Proverbs 9:9 says, "Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a just man, and he will increase in learning." So because they have this desire to be right, then they listen to wisdom and they learn. They end up being wiser. By the way, wisdom and righteousness in the book of Proverbs are intertwined. There's a lot of overlap. According to the book of Proverbs, if you do what's wise, you're going to do what's right. And if you do what's right, you're going to be wise. And there's a lot of overlap between the two, though there can be some differences. At any rate, I think that this kind of person who desires righteousness just wants to do what is right. In a sense, Proverbs 11:3 seems to indicate they're humble people. They accept correction with gratitude. They even welcome constructive criticism. So if you rebuke a wise person, they will love you. That's Proverbs 9:8. And they will learn. That's the one I read a minute ago, Proverbs 9:9. So the point is they have this desire and they listen to wisdom and they learn from it. Proverbs 11:28 says, "He who trusts in his riches will fail, but the righteous will flourish like foliage." And again, you've got to put both of these phrases together to get the full impact of what he's saying. In other words, he's saying in this case that those who are rich trust their riches, but the righteous trust, by implication, the Lord, and as a result, they're going to flourish like a tree. So they're going to flourish like the green leaves on a tree. But the point is, they trust the Lord. Matter of fact, Proverbs later says in 14:2, which I read a minute ago, "He who walks in righteousness fears the Lord." Another indication that this person is trusting the Lord, which is bound up in that expression, fear of the Lord. It indicates reverence and respect and trust. So the really righteous person, from a biblical point of view, is someone who knows the Lord and is trusting the Lord to be righteous. Then it says in Proverbs 18:10, "The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run to it and are safe." This is an extension of trusting the Lord. The minute they have trouble, they do what? They run to the Lord. They don't walk to the Lord, they run to the Lord. So they are trusting the Lord, and especially in a time of trouble. Consequently, Proverbs says in 15:29, "The Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayers of the righteous." So, if you're trusting the Lord and running to him when there is need, he hears you. Furthermore, Proverbs 15:8 says, The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight. What a choice morsel. That when you're in trouble and you go to the Lord, you're trusting him for whatever the need may be, he just delights to hear from you. So in other words, he's pleased to hear from you. He's not merely interested in what's going on. He really wants to know what's going on, and he is delighted that you come to him with it. By the way, this verse says, the sacrifice of the wicked. And in the Old Testament, sacrifice was part of their religion. So all of their religious activities are an abomination to the Lord. If you're going through all these religious stuff and you're wicked, well, that's an abomination. As you've heard me say before, the word abomination means he's disgusted. So if you just go through religious stuff and you end up living a wicked life, God is disgusted with that. But, according to this verse, if you go to him and trust him and you pray to him, he is delighted. In other words, the Lord's more interested in the way we live during the week than he is the fact that you go to church on Sunday. Or as it says in 1 Samuel 15:22, to obey is better than sacrifice. To obey is better than going through all this religious stuff. God is not interested in making you religious.
Amen.
If you mean by that going through religious stuff, like going to church. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't go to church. I'm saying you should go to church to be instructed in the Scripture.
Yes.
Not just to somehow think you're righteous because you go to church. Rather, God is interested in you having this internal righteousness that wants to please him. There's more. In Proverbs 11:20 it says, those who are of a perverse heart are an abomination to the Lord, but the blameless in their ways are his delight. In other words, the righteous not only think straight, as I mentioned a minute ago, they walk straight, which is the word that's used here, and they are a delight to the Lord. So, they think about righteousness. This is a very critical little proverb. It says in 12:5, the thoughts of the righteous are right. But the counsel of the wicked are deceitful. So, this is saying the righteous person thinks about righteousness. As a matter of fact, the word translated thoughts actually means plans or purposes or devices. So the righteous person thinks about doing what is right, plans to do what is right. That's the purpose. They think about righteousness. On the other hand, they hate sin. Listen to Proverbs 13:5. A righteous man hates lying, but a wicked man is loathsome and comes to shame. Lying probably includes being deceitful or falsehood. The righteous hate any kind of dishonesty. A man named Alan Blair talked about Abraham Lincoln and saying, quote, he would accept no case in which the client did not have justice on his side. One time a man came to employ him. Lincoln stared at the ceiling, yet listening intently as the facts were given. Abruptly he swung around in his chair, saying, you have a pretty good case in technical law, but a pretty bad one in justice. You have to get someone else to win that case for you. I cannot do it. For all the time while pleading before the jury, I'd be thinking, Lincoln, you're a liar. I might forgive myself and say it out loud. Righteous people hate lying. They hate injustice. Proverbs 29:27 says, an unjust man is an abomination to the righteous. Remember I said the word abomination means disgusting. Injustice is disgusting to a righteous person. Proverbs 29:27. So, because they think righteous, they have this desire to do righteous, they hate lying, they hate injustice, they have a clear conscience. Matter of fact, Proverbs 21:8 says, "The way of the guilty man is perverse, but for the pure his work is right." This is talking about guilt. Guilt causes a person to hide, to masquerade, to act deceitfully. But people with pure motives live righteous lives. They have nothing to hide. They're free from guilt. They have, in other words, a clear conscience. This is a very, very important concept. Paul talks about it in 1 Timothy 1:5. I've gone through this when I was going through 1 Timothy, but let me lay out what he's saying. He talks about faith that produces a pure heart and a good conscience that produces love. It's interesting. The Bible and elsewhere talks about faith producing love, that we trust the Lord, and what we ought to be doing after that is loving Him and others. But in that verse, Paul inserts a pure heart and a clear conscience. So, a righteous person has a clear conscience, and that's part of the way they can go love people. Guilty people are thinking about themselves, righteous people are thinking about others. Proverbs 2:7 says they have wisdom. Quote, "He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk uprightly." The word upright literally means integrity. God gives wisdom to those who are people of integrity. Proverbs 3:2 says, He gives them His secret counsel. It says, "For the perverse person is an abomination to the Lord, but His secret counsel is with the upright." In short, God shares His secrets with those who walk with Him. Jesus talked about that in John 15. He said, I used to call you servants. I'm not going to call you servants anymore. I'm going to call you friends. A servant doesn't know what the master's doing, but I'm going to call you friends, meaning I'm going to tell you what's going on. I mean, isn't that what a friend is? You tell them what's going on? Well, a righteous person is a friend of God. Abraham is called a friend of God. And the result of that is when you get close to the Lord and you're in His Word, He reveals His secret counsel to you. Wow. Consequently, righteous people are satisfied. Matter of fact, Proverbs 13:25 says, "The righteous eat to the satisfaction of his soul, but the stomach of the wicked is in want." When you are righteous, in the biblical sense of the term, there is a satisfaction to that. You're content. You're satisfied. Also, you're happy. Proverbs 29:6 says, "By transgression an evil man is snared, but the righteous sing and rejoice." Righteous people sing. Now, other people sing as well, but righteous sing from the heart because of the relationship they have with the Lord. Then it gets real interesting. Proverbs 12:10 says, "A righteous man regards the life of his animals, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel." Now, all you animal lovers will appreciate this. The verse is 12:10. Write that down. A wicked person is cruel to animals. Don't psychologists talk about that? That if a child is cruel to an animal, you better watch out? Proverbs, there's nothing new under the sun. Solomon said it a long time ago. But a righteous person is compassionate. even toward animals. Interesting. You don't normally put righteousness and compassion together in the same sentence, but Proverbs does. A righteous person is compassionate. Someone has said you can tell a lot about a person's character by the way they treat creatures which cannot defend themselves or fight back. An extension of that is in Proverbs 29:7. The righteous consider the cause of the poor, but the wicked does not understand such knowledge. The righteous person considers the plea and the struggle of those who are genuinely poor. On one of his visits to Jerusalem, early in his life ministry, the Apostle Paul met with the elders, and he wanted to make sure that they agreed with him about justification by faith. He describes all this in Galatians chapter 2. And in verse 10, he says, in essence, they desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing which I also was eager to do. So Paul says, look, you're justified by faith. What do you do after that? You live a righteous life. What does that mean? You're concerned for other people. That's what it means. Matter of fact, I just gave you all of Christianity. You get those two things down, I'm out of a job. Trust Christ and love one another. Amen. That's the essence of biblical Christianity. That's the essence of the Bible. Somebody came to Jesus and said, what's the greatest commandment? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart. And you didn't ask me, but I'm going to tell you the second one. Is love your neighbor as yourself. Then he said, I'm going to give you a new commandment. I'm going to up the ante. I'm going to up the bar. I want you to love one another as I have loved you. And I loved you by dying for you. That's Christianity. That's the whole ball of wax. So, I've been talking about what the righteous person is like. And I've said the righteous person has a desire for righteousness. They hate lying. And at the same time, they have a compassion toward animals and the poor. A righteous person is a loving person. Matter of fact, when I went through the book of Romans and got to chapter 12, it dawned on me this book is talking about righteousness, and it ends up saying you ought to love one another. That in the book of Romans, righteousness is loving other people. So anyone who is committed to righteousness without having compassion is not righteous in the biblical sense of the term. They are self-righteous. They do not have the God kind of righteousness that's taught in the Bible. I don't know where I got it, but years ago I came across a little poem. I use it in counseling sometime. Here lies the body of James Gray, who died while taking the right of way. He was right, dead right, as he sped along, but he's just as dead as if he were wrong. Now, there are some people who are so right, they're obnoxious. That's all they are. They're rigid. They're stuffed shirts. A biblically righteous person tries to obey the law, but is compassionate. And that makes a huge difference. Put those two things together. Peter Marshall was a chaplain for the United States Senate years ago. And he said, Lord, when we are wrong, make us willing to change. And when we are right, make us easy to live with. That's the kind of righteousness the book of Proverbs is about. All right, what I've talked about so far is what they are, what they think. Now I want to talk about the second thing, what comes out of their mouth. So, Proverbs 15:28 says, they think before they speak. Oh boy, this gets convicting. The heart of the righteous studies how to answer. That's Proverbs 15:28. But the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil. They study what to answer. They think before they speak. Proverbs 10:32 says that what comes out of their mouth is acceptable. The lips of the righteous know what is acceptable, but the mouth of the wicked is perverse. Acceptable means goodwill, favor. What they say is of benefit to others. Proverbs 10:21 said, the lips of the righteous feed many, but the fool die for lack of wisdom. They feed others. That term is used of a ruler or a guide. It guides other people. Proverbs 10:11 says, the mouth of the righteous is a well of life, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. It's a well of life. It means a well of water that is refreshing to other people, like the weary traveler in the desert. The words benefit other people. It's helpful to them. It's healing to them. But the words can also be bold. Proverbs 28:1 says, the wicked flee when no one pursues. That's because they're guilty. But the righteous are bold as a lion. Interesting. Matter of fact, I did a little study of boldness once in 1 Thessalonians, where Paul talks about it, and came to the conclusion that when you think about yourself, you don't speak up. But when you're thinking about somebody else and you're concerned about their benefit, you become bold when necessary. So, righteous people are bold. And they also say what is of value. Proverbs 10:20 says, the tongue of the righteous is choice silver. The heart of the wicked is worth little. So what they say is of value. Sterling character produces sterling speech. Proverbs 12:13 says, they speak truth and avoid trouble. The wicked are ensnared by the transgression of his lips, but the righteous will come through trouble. Proverbs 12:6 says, what they speak can deliver other people. The words of the wicked are, lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright will deliver them. Righteous people deliver people from the snare by what they say. They rescue victims trapped by slander or gossip. Proverbs 16:13 says, righteous lips are a delight to the king. They love him who speaks what is right. In other words, righteous people speak the truth, and people like kings appreciate that. Are you pleased when your friends tell you the truth? Sometimes that can sting. But righteous people speak the truth, and other people delight in hearing the truth. It also says in Proverbs 10:31, the mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom, but the perverse tongue will be cut out. So it brings forth wisdom. And the little Hebrew expression brings forth actually means to bear fruit. So this really captures what the righteous say. They speak the truth, they speak wisdom, they speak what is beneficial to others, but it's because that's the fruit of who they are. That's the critical concept. A tree is known by its fruit. When you see apples, you know there's an apple tree. When you see oranges, you know there's an orange tree. Likewise, when you hear righteous, wise words, you know it's coming from a righteous, wise person. Have you ever heard the expression, by your fruits you shall know them? You ever heard that expression? Yeah. Most people take it that it means that the fruit of righteous people is a righteous life. But it's not talking about that. That exact phrase doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible. But it comes from two passages in the book of Matthew, both of which record what Jesus is saying. It's in Matthew 7:15-20 and in Matthew 12:33-37. And in both of those passages, he's not talking about a righteous life. He's talking about righteous or unrighteous speech. speech. As a matter of fact, right in the middle of the one in Matthew chapter 12, he says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. Now that sort of sums up everything I've said thus far. What is a righteous person like according to the book of Proverbs? And for that matter, according to the Bible. They covet righteousness. They want to do what's right. But that includes benefiting other people. And so what comes out of their mouth does just that. It's a fruit. A fruit is not produced for the benefit of the fruit tree. Fruit is for the benefit of somebody else. Apple trees don't grow apples for apple trees. Apples grow apples for me. I love apples. They got the message. So righteous people they speak what is of benefit to others. They are fruitful in helping other people. One more. I've talked about who they are and what they say. Let's talk about what they do. Proverbs 11:3 says, the integrity of the upright will guide them, but the perversity of the unfaithful will destroy them. In other words, they do what's right. Proverbs 21:29 says, a wicked man hardens his faith, but the upright is established in his ways. They do what's right, and they are established in the way they live. 15:19 says, the way of the lazy man is like a hedge of thorns, but the way of the upright is a highway. In other words, lazy people see difficulties and problems as hindrances. A hedge. Righteous people, they're moving down a road like it's a highway. And they don't stumble. 4:18 says, but the path of the just is like the shining sun that shines ever brightly unto a perfect day. In other words, they don't stumble because they're walking around as if it were the noonday and they can see, and they don't stumble over anything. 10:25 says, when the whirlwind passes by, the wicked is no more, but the righteous has an everlasting foundation. So when the storms come, they are established. They do not stumble. They can weather the storm. Proverbs 12:26 says, the righteous should choose his friends carefully, for the way of the wicked leads them astray. Stop. Grab a pencil. Get a piece of paper. If you are a parent, a grandparent, or work with children, especially teenagers, give them this verse. Proverbs 12:26, quote, the righteous choose their friends carefully. That's one of the things righteous people do. Why? Because their friends can lead them astray if they are wicked. Now, I've talked about this before in this series and pointed out that the issue is, are you influencing them or are they influencing you? So Jesus was the friend of publicans and sinners, but he was influencing them. They weren't influencing him. So choose your friends carefully. That's a direct quote out of Proverbs. Did you write down? Pop quiz. What verse? Oh, you did. 12:26. All right. 16:17 says, the highway of the upright is to depart from evil. He who keeps his ways preserves his soul, which means he preserves his life. This is another way of saying they don't stumble because they're walking in righteousness. Proverbs 11:4 says, the right riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. The day of wrath is reference to death here. And the point is that when God judges, money isn't going to buy off the judge or buy the judge out of the judgment, leading to premature death. So, righteousness is a safeguard against premature death. I have a lot to say about that, but that's later in the series in Proverbs. Did you catch that? What was that? Oh, you're learning. That's a commercial. We'll talk about premature death. The book of Proverbs has a lot to say about that. More about that later. All right. How are we doing?
Yeah.
I tell you there's going to be a lot of material?
Yes.
Did I tell you it was going to be simple? Yeah. What do righteous people want? Righteousness. What do righteous people say? Righteousness. What do righteous people do?
Righteousness.
But righteousness, according to the Bible, isn't just being self-righteous. It's being concerned for the Lord and other people. That's a whole big difference. Let me make an observation about that. I mentioned in the beginning that if I were going to think about righteousness, I'd go to the Ten Commandments. I'd go to the book of Exodus. Did you ever look at the Ten Commandments? They're negative. Only 2 of them are positive. One that says, keep the Sabbath day holy and honor your father and mother. All the rest of them are negative. Don't steal, don't lie, don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't covet, don't have any other gods before you. They're all negative. Now, that has a place, but properly understood, righteousness in the book of Proverbs is not just negative, it is positive. Because you are doing what's best for other people. You're speaking things that are going to help other people. It has to do with honoring the Lord. They're very positive things connected with righteousness in the Bible. All right. Boy, did I dump a lot of material on you. If I were going to sum it all up, I'd say this. The righteous have a desire for righteousness. They listen and learn. They trust the Lord. They run to the Lord for safety. They pray. When they do, the Lord delights in their prayers. They think righteous thoughts. They hate lying. They detest unjust people. They consider the cause of the poor. They are compassionate, even toward animals. They have a clear conscience. They have the wisdom of the Lord. They know the Lord's secrets. They're satisfied and content. They think before they speak. They know what is acceptable to say. What they say benefits others. They are bold at times. They say what is of value. They speak the truth and avoid trouble. What they say when they speak the truth delivers people from trouble and speaks wisdom. They do what's right. They're established by wisdom. They work through problems. They do not stumble. They make it through the storms of life. They choose their friends carefully. And they do not. They preserve their life. Is that a mouthful or what? Did you get all that? You want to be righteous? Here's what you got to do. First, trust Jesus Christ. Then you're righteous before God. Secondly, desire to do what's right according to the Scripture. Say what's right. Do what's right. And that's righteousness before people. That's righteousness in the Bible. Don't give your righteousness before people to God thinking that's going to impress Him to give you heaven. That ain't going to work. You give Him your sin and He gives you righteousness of Christ. That's righteousness before God. Righteousness before people is an entirely different matter, and that's what the book of Proverbs is talking about. Now, I want to conclude by saying just a couple of things. One is, you can lose your righteousness. I'm not talking about righteousness before God. That's irrevocable. The gifts and callings of God are irrevocable. That's in Romans 11. Talking about this righteousness, practical righteousness, you can lose it. And the book of Proverbs warns about that. Proverbs 28:10 says, "Whoever causes the upright to go astray in an evil way, he himself will fall into its own pit, but the blameless will inherit good." This verse is saying that wicked people can lead righteous people astray, which is why you should choose your friends carefully. If they are influencing you in that direction, choose your friends carefully. But the point is, you could be led into unrighteousness. So, when you do that, you're of no benefit to anybody. Proverbs 25:26 says, a righteous man will falter before the wicked like a murky spring and a polluted well. Remember earlier, the righteous person spoke that which was a well of water that refreshes people and helps people. If you lose your righteousness, you're going to be like a murky spring and a polluted well. What's the point? Nobody's going to drink from your fountain. You're not going to benefit anybody else. You're going to muddy up the place. So, the point is, you can lose your practical righteousness. Now, can I give you a quick lesson on how to do that? I'm going to teach you how to lose your righteousness. I just spent this whole time telling you how to be righteous, and I'm going to tell you how to lose it. Turn to James chapter 1. James chapter 1. Look at verse 19. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, which I think is the outline of the book of James. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Let me tell you how to destroy the process of not producing the righteousness of God in a practical way in your life. Just harbor anger. If you're an angry person, you're not going to be focused on the Lord. You're certainly not going to be doing what He said, and it'll destroy your practical righteousness. So, put away anger. Be slow to speak and swift to hear the Word of God, which in context is what James is saying. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a Methodist evangelist named Bob Jones. He started a Christian college. At first was in Florida, then moved to Tennessee, and ended up in South Carolina. It is till this day a university. When I was a young Christian, he was quoted a lot. He had Proverbs. And I don't know what it was about those things. I never heard the man speak. But his Proverbs were floating around, and some of them just stuck with me. For example, don't sacrifice the permanent on the altar of the immediate. The greatest ability is dependability. But several of his Proverbs that he constantly preached in chapel to his students had to do with righteousness. Some of them I had to look up. But the last one that I want to share with you is the one that stuck with me. One was, the two biggest little words in the English language are the two little words, do right. Another was, it is never right to do wrong in order to get a chance to do right. But the one that stuck with me, that I remember very vividly, the one I want to leave you with is this. He said, do right. Until the stars fall from the sky, do right. Amen. I think that sort of sums up the book of Proverbs. Do right by desiring it, speaking it, and doing what is right, especially in helping other people. Father,